Okay, kids. We're going to talk about the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, Part 2, the Civil Rights Movement. Almost all of our lecture will talk about this particular time in American history, and I've said to you several times that Johnson was probably the greatest civil rights president. Nobody remembers because of the Vietnam crisis, which will be Part 3 of our lecture, next test material. Now, during the Johnson administration, civil rights is going to be a major issue. It was kind of touched upon. During the Eisenhower administration, he just ignored it. He didn't do anything for it. He didn't do anything against it. He just standed pat. Didn't want to deal with it. Kennedy tried to get into it, but was assassinated before he could really get any teeth into it. So Lyndon Johnson's the man that's going to deal with civil rights during his presidency more than anyone else. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 6 instances of continued violence that occurred in the United States concerning civil rights during the Johnson administration. And although these are 6 instances of continued violence, he is going to make some great strides in trying to fix this violence. So during the Johnson administration, civil rights would be a major issue in the United States, and the following are 6 instances of continued violence concerning civil rights in the United States during the Johnson administration. And the first one is called the Freedom Summer Project. Freedom Summer Project. Oh, I gave you some, remember, during the Kennedy administration? These are during the Johnson. The first one's the Freedom Summer Project. Now, this occurred in 1964, and the Freedom Summer Project was a group of civil rights workers who were making preparations to try to register as many blacks as possible to vote in the state of Mississippi. So the Freedom Summer Project is a civil rights organization that in 1964 made preparations to register as many blacks as possible to vote in the state of Mississippi. That was their goal. The Freedom Summer Project was going to try in 1964 to register as many blacks as possible to vote in the state of Mississippi. Why do you think, Callie, they would pick the state of Mississippi?
Because it was covered with abortion as far as civil rights.
In voter registration. Matter of fact, in the state of Mississippi at the time, 50% of the population was black, yet less than 5% of Negroes registered to vote. So you had a state with a 50% black population, yet less than 5% of those blacks eligible to vote registered. So that's why they targeted Mississippi, is because, as Callie said, had a very poor registration rate as far as blacks registering to vote. Now, every state has many counties. This is Washakie County. Every state has counties. There were some Mississippi counties that there were not one black registered to vote in that county. Not one. So you had certain counties in Mississippi in which not one black person registered to vote. That's just kind of unbelievable when you think about it. When 50% of the state's population is black, to have any county that wouldn't have a black registered voter was unusual. So that's why the Freedom Summer Project came to Mississippi, to try to get as many blacks to register. Now, most of the people that were involved in the Freedom Summer Project, believe it or not, were white college students. There were blacks, but a big majority of these members of the Freedom Summer Project were white college students. So these civil rights workers, known as the Freedom Summer Project, came to Mississippi. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did not go with them. He did not join them in this effort. Anybody want to know why? Why didn't Martin Luther King, who was usually at the front of everything, what?
He was busy.
No? Dallas Kennedy and his aides? Think of that.
They didn't want to go because they didn't want anything bad to happen.
Well, they were really concerned about his safety. For the first time, backers of Martin Luther King Jr. are worrying about his safety. And so because of safety concerns, not that we're going to make fun of him or hurt him, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. It wasn't the words they were worried about. They were actually worried about his safety. So they chose not to take him there. His aides advised him not to participate. Well, as you can imagine, the people lived in Mississippi didn't care much for this Freedom Summer Project. They referred to it as, quote, an invasion of outside agitation. So native Mississippians referred to the Freedom Summer Project and their efforts as, quote, an invasion of outside agitation. An invasion of outside agitation. They didn't particularly like these civil rights workers coming to their state to tell them what they should be doing as far as registering black voters. So again, I'm going to give you 4 examples of violence that occurred during this Freedom Summer Project's attempt to try to register black voters. What do you think some of the volunteers were? What happened to them? What? Beaten? Okay, so there's one example. Again, violence occurred. First example, many of these volunteers in the Freedom Summer Project were beaten. Homes of blacks that lived in Mississippi were burned to the ground. Homes of blacks that lived in Mississippi were burned to the ground. What else would be a target that might be damaged and burned other than black homes? Black churches, very good. Local black churches were damaged and burned. Local black churches were damaged and burned as well. So you had volunteers that were beaten, homes of blacks that were burned, local churches were damaged and or burned. And there were even people killed. And I'm going to give you an example of that occurred on June 21st, 1964. June 21st, 1964. 3 of these civil rights workers that were members of the Freedom Summer Project went missing. They were investigating a church burning in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Went down there to investigate that church burning there and just came up missing. Okay? So on June 21st, 1964, 3 of the civil rights workers, members of the Freedom Summer Project, went down to investigate a church burning in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and they went missing. They were Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Earl Cheney. Those were the 3 civil rights workers that went missing while they were investigating a church burning in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Earl Cheney. Those were the 3 missing individuals from the civil rights group that went to Mississippi to try to get more black registered voters. Now Goodman and Schwerner, what color do you think they were by maybe their name? White. So Goodman and Schwerner were white men from New York City, and Cheney was a black man from Mississippi. So the 3 missing civil rights workers, Goodman and Schwerner, were white men from New York City. Cheney was a black man from Mississippi. Well, a month after these 3 men disappeared, Dr. King decided to join in with the Freedom Summer Project and lend a hand trying to get these blacks to register to vote in Mississippi. So a month after the men went missing, Martin Luther King shows up in Mississippi and becomes part of the Freedom Summer Project and gets himself involved. And he thought it was better to die for doing something good than sitting idle and having things not happen as far as the goal went. So he sat out for a while and he decided, you know, it's better for me to die doing something productive for the civil rights movement than sitting at home idle, watching nothing getting done. That was his philosophy. So he joins the movement. And he gives a speech about the missing men during the time that they are in Mississippi trying to get blacks registered to vote. He gives a speech about the missing men. And finally, in August of 1964, they find their bodies. So King goes to Mississippi, he ends up giving a speech about the missing men, and then after his speech, they're finally found in August of 1964. They whoever killed them, buried them in what's called an earthen dam. In other words, a dam that's made out of earth, you know, that stops water from coming through. They just simply dug holes in that earthen dam and threw them in there and buried them. So they were found, buried in an earthened dam. It's a dam that's made out of dirt that stops water like a reservoir. You've seen those, and they just dug holes in the earthen dam and buried, okay, but they were found. Guess who gave the eulogy for the 3 murdered civil rights workers at the funeral? Dr. Martin Luther King. So, Dr. King gave the eulogy at the funeral for those 3 murdered civil rights workers in Mississippi. And after the Freedom Summer Project ended, it only resulted in about 1,200 new blacks registered. That's not very many in the state of Mississippi. So they made some progress, but not a lot. By the time they got done with the Freedom Summer Project, it resulted in only about 1,200 new black voters in the state. Not very many at all. Okay, in mid-October 1964, Dr. King was so fatigued from his grueling effort for the civil rights movement, he had to be hospitalized. In mid-October of 1964, Dr. King was hospitalized for fatigue because of his grueling efforts for the civil rights movement. So he has to be hospitalized. During his recovery, he received some interesting news. Positive news. During his recovery, he received some interesting and positive news. His wife, Coretta, gave him this news. He had been named the 1964 recipient of the what? Nobel Peace Prize. Yep. So during his recovery, Dr. King received the news from his wife, Coretta, that he had been named the 1964 recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Anybody know where you traveled to get that?
Switzerland.
Close. Oslo, Norway. Oslo, Norway. And so in December, after recovering from his fatigue, King traveled to Oslo, Norway to receive his award. Now they also give you a cash prize for that. And this is 1964. Guess how much it was? $54,000, which would amount to $500,000 now, probably, if you really did the math to it. And you know what he did with that money rather than keep it? Donated it all back to the civil rights movement. He did not keep a dime. $54,000 was his cash prize for winning the Nobel Peace Prize. So he goes to Oslo, Norway, receives his Nobel Peace Prize and the $54,000 which went with it, and he donated it, the entire amount to the civil rights movement in America, which would be, I bet, $500,000 in today's cash. Okay? Now this is what he said on December 10th, after getting his award. He said this in his acceptance speech. This is what he said in his acceptance speech on December 10th, 1964, when he received not only his award, but the cash prize that went with it. This is what he stated in his acceptance speech. Write down what you think is important. Quote, "I accept the Nobel Prize of Peace at a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice." He stated at the end of his speech, the beginning of his speech, I accept the Nobel Prize of Peace at a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice. I accept the Nobel Prize of Peace at a moment when 22 million Negroes of the United States are engaged in a creative battle to end the long night of racial injustice. So that is our first of 6 examples of violence that occurred during the Johnson administration concerning civil rights. And we'll talk about Selma, Alabama tomorrow.